Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the second lab. Today will be a very extensive lab. There will be two lectures that you'll have to look at separately. This lecture is the first one, so just make sure that you go through all of today's lecture or this first lecture first before you go ahead and move on to the second lecture. In this first lecture, I'm going to go ahead and lecture on APA style, what consists of an APA manuscript and the important parts related to that. So let's go ahead and jump into that first. The second lecture will be on the first experiment. So the second lecture will be exclusively me detailing what you need to know, what you need to do to be able to collect the data for the first experiment, submit that successfully, and so on and so forth. So I'll go ahead and once I get there, break that down piece by piece. But in this first lecture, let's go ahead and just get into some general lecture about APA style. All right. All right, so this lecture is already on Blackboard. It is titled APA Papers dash style. If you'd like to just pull that up or follow along, whatever works best for you. All right. So for the most part, APA papers are based on quantitative research, meaning that we write up papers that in some way or another deal with numeric data. APA papers can be based on both experimental or quasi-experimental designs. For the most part, in the lecture piece of this course, you'll be learning mainly about experimental studies. Experimental studies use both independent and dependent variables. Both of these things you will be able to hear about from the lecture piece of the course, but I'll just go ahead and define these very briefly now. So independent variables are variables that you manipulate. So these are the variables that researchers have control over in a study. Dependent variables are variables that are measured in the study. So just to give a quick example, if a researcher is interested in studying how different types of study strategies impact GPA, type of study strategy would be the independent variable. Why? Because this is the variable that the researcher would manipulate, meaning that he might have three groups of people. One group might receive a rehearsal strategy or a rehearsal study strategy. The other one might be a note-taking study strategy. And the last one might be simply flashcard study strategy. So these are three different types of a study strategy. And at that point, the researcher created those conditions, right? Therefore, that would become the independent variable itself. And he or she is interested in looking at how type of study strategy impacts the dependent variable of GPA. So very briefly, this is what these two types of variables are. As I said, you'll learn more about these in your lecture. Moving down a little bit farther down, so APA papers have both a method and the results section. Multiple experiments can be part of one paper, and there are areas of psychology in which APA papers are written in. One of these can be experimental psychology, which is in fact the title of this course. So we'll be doing two of these papers throughout the lab section, as you already know. Qualitative papers, on the other hand, are more of the descriptive type of papers, so there is no numeric quantities being analyzed in this type of paper. It's mostly data coming from interviews, personal observations, case studies, and so on and so forth. There are mixed method articles, so these are articles in which both types of data are looked at, so both qualitative and quantitative. And then lastly, replication articles. So these are articles that try to mimic already published papers out there. This was not done as much before, but that is becoming more the case as as time goes by, because we have really identified the benefits of replication papers, especially now that we're living in what we call the replication crisis in psychology, in which a lot of the previous findings that were prominent back then were actually not replicating years later. So that sort of called into question why these popular findings were not replicating, and maybe trying to identify what the discrepancies are. All right, we have meta-analyses. So this is where you take a large sample of studies that have already been published, and you analyze this group of studies into one analysis that we call a meta-analysis. And we try to retrieve conclusions or make conclusions based on this large group of papers. We have literature reviews. So these are more of going through the research, going through the literature, and figuring out what the common tendencies are, what are the theories that have been written about, and so on and so forth, and sort of summarize a piece of the literature in one paper. All right, and then we have theoretical or methodological reviews, very similar to the literature reviews, but they focus specifically either on theory or on method exclusively. So it's just two different types of literature reviews, but with a specific emphasis on either theories or methodologies. All right. We'll go ahead and skip over this. We'll come back to this much later. So in this class, as you know, we'll be writing two APA style papers. They will be two research studies. Obviously, the best way of learning is by doing. So all papers, because they are APA papers, do have to adhere to proper APA formatting. All right. So let's go ahead and skip to here. So sections of an APA paper. This is really the meat of this lecture today. We have three broad sections that we can think about. We have what are called pre-pages. These contain both the title page and the abstract. The title page will be the first page of the paper, followed by the abstract after that. Then we get into what we call the actual paper. So that involves, or that includes, the introduction, the method, the results, and the discussion. This is considered the meat of the paper. And then after these sections, we have what we call the post pages. So the references, the tables, the figures, and the appendix. So from the title page down to the appendix is everything that is included in a typical APA style paper. All right, so for the title page, what do we need to know? We will practice writing out a title page or coming up with titles of papers specifically for your own experiment one that you'll be starting today. So just pay extra attention to this section of the lecture, because you'll need to know this proper formatting to be able to write a correct title page. So a running head and a page number, that's necessary. The title of the paper, author names, affiliation, and author notes. So let's go ahead and jump into each one of these subsections. So for the running head, that needs to be at the very top of the paper. You're going to insert this via a header. You're going to flush left, meaning that you're just simply moving the running head as far left as you can along the top of the paper. Everything is in caps. And the running head really should be a quick statement that encapsulates what the paper is about. This first experiment, as you'll see later on, is studying proofreading. So it could be as simple as proofreading for that first experiment. All right. In terms of the more nitty-gritty details, it has to be 50 characters or less. If you go over 50 characters, points will be docked. This includes spaces between words. So if you decide to go with just the running head of proofreading, you should be completely fine and meet that expectation there. No abbreviations, ampersands can be used in lieu of and. So like I said, for this first experiment, that is not really relevant if you decide to go with just the running head of proofreading. In terms of the page number, that is placed on the top right. So you're going to flush that all the way to the right as much as you can. And that is one thing that people usually tend to forget. And importantly, the stuff in purple will highlight what the changes or how these guidelines are different from the ones in the 6th edition of the APA manual. So in the 6th edition, and sort of what I grew up on, was that before you actually wrote the running head, the words running head would precede that. So it would be running head colon whatever the running head was. However, that is no longer necessary for the 7th edition. You just simply write what the running head is. All right. The title itself, first of all, what should a title read like? What should it contain? What should it convey to the reader? It should be a quick summary of the main idea of the manuscript. So in this case, it could be proofreading strategies and something else, right? Or just simply proofreading strategy, so on and so forth, as long as you're encapsulating the idea of the paper. It should be concise. It should be speaking directly to the main topic of the paper. Good titles include the variables that were examined in the study or the theoretical issues that were investigated and the relationship between them. So any combination of those would lead to a great title. All right, so there's the format there at the bottom in purple. So the effects of the IV on the DV. So in this case, it would be the effects of reading strategy on proofreading or something like that, as you'll see later on. Okay. So the title is centered. It's positioned in the upper half of the page, so not completely at the top of the page, but not completely at the bottom, so somewhere in the middle. The title is capitalized, so all the important words are capitalized. So things like and so or then would not be capitalized, but things like proofreading, reading strategies, social anxiety, working memory, things like that would be capitalized. It has to take on this inverted pyramid if more than one line long. So if your title page is more than one line long, you would have to sort of format it to where it shrinks down in a pyramid fashion. But once again, for this first experiment, you won't have to worry about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. There is an author name and affiliation section to the title page. So it's your full name. Okay, spell out your university. Cal State is not acceptable, so you have to write out California State University, San Bernardino. And just in case this is a lot of information so far, just know that an example is coming up that'll place a visual in terms of what to expect. So don't worry if there's so many details and you're not able to keep up. Just know that there is an example title page posted. Well, in a slide later on in the PowerPoint. All right, that section of the title page is also center justified, double spaced, and that's directly below the title. So you'll see that in just a second. All right, the author note is labeled author note. That is the last thing on the title page. And because of that, it is placed at the bottom of the page. It is, like I said, titled author note. That is centered. And then each component after that is a separate paragraph. And these are not centered. Okay, they are just indented accordingly, and that is all. All right, so the first component is what is called an ORCID. So this is not applicable. So don't worry about that. This is if you were actually publishing a real paper based on a real study. So let's go ahead and skip to the second one. Changes of affiliation, also not applicable. Acknowledgements and disclosures, so conflicts of interest, so on and so forth. We will have a statement on that saying that there was no conflict of interest for the current study, so on and so forth. And then lastly, contact information. So this will include your name, your email, and the address of the university that you are representing. So that will be the address of Cal State San Bernardino. All right, so like I said, here is the example. Your title page should look exactly like this in terms of the formatting. Of course, you will be having different information, so the content that is here will be different. So instead of the effects of color on paper, you might have something like the effects of reading strategy on proofreading. Your name, as you can see there, the name of the institution was spelled out all the way. So California State University, comma, San Bernardino. We have the author note at the bottom. So you're going to mimic something like that. And then this page is numbered at the top right. So page 1, flushed right. The running head is flushed left. So as long as you mimic this formatting here, you should be in great shape for turning in a good title page. All right, so what about the abstract? What should we need to know about the abstract? First of all, it is a very concise but complete summary of what the study is about or what the paper is about. Okay, this begins on a new page, so this should be directly right after the title page. The word abstract is centered and bolded. Please don't forget about that. It is a single paragraph without indentation, so you don't indent the first sentence. You just start writing, and by the time you're done, it should just be one big block of text. It is limited to 250 words or less, so please make sure that you do not go over the word limit. Below the abstract itself, there is a section called keywords. So as we can see here, you will have something like this. So it'll say keywords, and then it'll be followed by keywords that you believe are vital to the paper. So things like proofreading, reading strategies, those kinds of words will be relevant for you guys in this first experiment. Okay. And like it says here, each keyword should be relevant to your study and specific enough to be useful in a search. So the reason for having keywords there is that the moment that a paper is published in a system and the publishers of the paper have identified these keywords, people that type in those keywords will most likely be presented with this paper. So on something like Google Scholar, whatever keywords you listed in your paper should be the ones that are tagged into the search that leads to finding your paper. All right, 3 to 5 keywords is what's recommended. All right, in terms of the content, so just like I said, it's a brief summary of every part of the paper. So that's why this would be referred to as a mini paper. You would include a brief description of the problem that's being investigated. So what is the research question? What is the purpose of the study? A brief description of the method, so maybe participants, materials, and procedures. So we'll talk about those sections in just a second. The results, so what did you find? And then lastly, what do your results mean? So what are the implications of the study? What do you conclude? All right, so just keep that in mind. Now we get to the meat of the paper, the body of the paper. So this includes the intro, method, results, and discussion. So from the moment that you are done with the abstract, the introduction through the discussion are just one continuous document. So you don't start the method on a brand new page, you don't start the results on a brand new page. You just simply, so if the introduction ended halfway through a page, you would continue the method section on that page. So you would not start it on a different page. So just make sure you have that clear, the introduction through the discussion, is one continuous document. All right. So the intro. Okay. So its importance lies in laying out the rationale for the study. So detailing or discussing previous research that leads to the purpose of the current study. So really what you're doing is that you're building an argument, you're building a rationale, a logic for why your study is important. In order to do that, you need to talk about previous research. You need to figure out what's been done, propose to the researcher that even though this has been done, we don't know X or we don't know Y, right? And that's the whole point of the introduction, to sort of set up the rationale for the purpose of the current study. So just keep that in mind. All right. This begins with the title of the paper repeated at the top of the page. So right after the abstract, the third page would be the introduction, and it would be with the introduction bolded at the top of the page, and it should match the title page exactly. So whatever title you put in the title page, that should be the exact same title that you have in the introduction. All right. So like I said before, what is the purpose of the intro? It's to set up the rationale for the study. It provides an overview of past research on the topic. Very importantly, it identifies similarities and differences between previous studies and your current work. That's huge for an introduction. It describes the importance of the problem. And at the very end of the introduction, it states the specific hypotheses and planned analyses. So you start general. So you start with a broad overview of the topic. So in this case, it would be proofreading. You would detail, you would go from very broad to specific in an inverted funnel shape. So we'll look at that in just a second. So you would start broad. You would move on to the lit review, so talking about research that has been done in whatever topic it is that you're writing about. Linking paragraphs, meaning that your transitions are smooth. You're going from idea A to idea B to idea C in a very logical manner. And finally, you would end with the purpose of the study, the hypothesis or hypotheses. So let's look at how this would look. Let's go ahead and skip over this here. So this funnel shape is probably your best friend when writing the introduction. As you're writing, you have to continuously picture this in your mind. You start broad, right, like the top of the funnel, and throughout the introduction, you're getting narrower and narrower and narrower till finally you get to what are called the hypotheses. Okay, so the structure of the introduction should read like this. Okay. Important, the broad and narrow refer to the level of information, not the amount. Meaning that you don't write more at the start and write less at the end. Rather, it's how deep you talk about the content at the start and how deep you could talk about the content at the end. Okay, so it does not mean amount of words, amount of pages. It means the level, okay, of the content. The majority of your introduction should involve research with information specific to your study. And we'll get to these general guidelines in terms of how long that should be. So I'll be posting a guideline for the introduction, and that'll really detail how long the different pieces of the introduction should be. Right? For now, I just want to provide a general overview of these sections of an APA paper. All right, the method. The method is most crucial for replication, meaning that in order for somebody else to be able to replicate your study, you have to provide as much details for them to be able to do that successfully. So the method requires a good balance between completeness and conciseness. Completeness, the question should be, have I provided enough information so that another researcher could replicate the study? Okay. If the answer is yes, then you have successfully checked off that requirement. However, if you feel that something is lacking, if you put yourselves in the shoes of another researcher and think, would I be able to replicate with what I've written here so far? And the answer is no, then you might have to further detail, things that you maybe didn't include. For conciseness, the question is, if I change this detail, would it possibly affect the results? So here, if you read that chunk there at the bottom, if you tell me participants selected their answers on the questionnaire, I do not need to know if the answers were circled or underlined, nor what type of writing utensils they used. A participant would not select a different response if they circled with a pen rather than underlined in pencil, meaning that too much detail is also overkill, right? So you don't want to provide the brand of the pen or the brand of the pencil that the participants use, right? That's irrelevant to the paper. You want to be complete and you want to be concise, but within the realm of being relevant, right? You don't want to become irrelevant. Okay, the method itself has 4 subsections, so make sure that you have this really clear in your mind as you're writing this section. And they are always occurring in this order. So participants first. So this is where you briefly describe who the participants were, how many of them were there. You outline things like what was the average age, what was the average ethnicity, what was the average, level of English proficiency or things like that. And that section is concluded with an ethical principle statement that I'll be providing to you guys. All right. All measures and materials that you used in the study go under the materials section. Okay. So anything from questionnaires to cognitive programs that you might have used and things of that sort. Then you move on to the third section of the method, which is the procedure. So this is where you detail what the participants did. So keywords would be: first, participants were presented with informed consent. Then participants completed the questionnaire. After that, participants were debriefed, so on and so forth. So it's the detailing actions. In the materials, you do not use any verbs. You stick to only describing what the materials were, right? You don't say participants were given the questionnaire or participants completed this or they completed that. That is strictly only for the procedures. The material section, all you do is just outline the materials. So if it was a questionnaire, you say the questionnaire contained 50 questions. The questions were designed to assess statistics anxiety or whatever the case is. So you just stick to describing the materials only. Okay. And the last subsection is the design and statistical analysis. So this is where you detail what type of analysis was done or will be done to analyze your data. All right. So I won't go into detail in terms of all of these sections, at least for the method. What I want you to do though is that when you're getting ready to write up the method draft, that you make sure that you have looked at these slides in particular, because everything that you need to know in terms of what to include is in here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just skip through a few of these slides, but just know that you do have to come back and look at these to be able to write the method completely. All right. Okay. So we'll go ahead and stop here. So at the results, this is the next section in the paper. So we've already gone over the title page. We've gone over the abstract. We've gone over the introduction. Okay. We've gone over the method. Now we're at the results. piece of the APA manuscript. Here's where you report all of the statistical analyses. What did you find? For those of you who took 210 at Cal State, or who might have taken statistics at another college or at a community college, everything that you learned in that course, from t-tests to ANOVAs to correlations and so on and so forth, that's where you would write this out in this part of the paper. P-values and degrees of freedom and all of that good stuff. Any tables or figures that you use, you must reference in this section. So for this first experiment, we will be creating a figure and we will be creating a table. So there will only be one of each. So somewhere in the results section, you have to say, see figure 1, see table 1, because if you don't, right, that is not adhering to APA formatting. And more importantly, the reader won't know that there is a table and that there is a figure. Tables and figures make it easier for the reader to digest what is being written in the results section. As you know, the results section is one of the sections that is always skipped over by readers. Readers start to look at the numbers, the weird Greek symbols, and they say, you know what, I'm done, I'm moving forward, let's skip to the discussion. However, for this course, that is not the case, right? You'll have to be able to write your own results section and know what is being said in each one of those sentences within that section. So just you'll ease into it as we go. All right, here are some very important guidelines for writing a results section. So for example, when we report the statistics themselves, if a finding is significant, and we're doing this within the context of a t-test, you would have the t followed by parentheses in which the degrees of freedom are inserted equals whatever the t-value is, comma, the p-value. Here you don't necessarily, it's not important for you now to know exactly what the numbers mean or what they don't mean. Just pay attention to the formatting. So it's the t followed by the degrees of freedom, followed by the t-value, comma, the p-value. As long as you know that things go in that order, that's all you should, that's all you should know for now. Later, we'll talk about what the numbers mean, what the p-value means, and so on and so forth, okay? For another analysis, for example, like a one-way ANOVA, you would have an F value, okay, followed by a P value in that order, okay? So once again, you have an F, degrees of freedom, what the F value is, then the P value, and so on and so forth, okay? Very importantly, you will not need SPSS. You will not need to conduct any analyses yourself. You will not need to analyze any of the data yourself. All of that will be taken care of by the 311 instructors, just as myself and the rest of the other lab instructors. We will do that completely. What will happen once we do that is that we'll go over the results as a class, and we'll talk about what we found. So don't worry about remembering how to use SPSS or anything like that. Once again, you will not need to do that yourself. Everything will be done for you in terms of the data analysis. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the discussion. The discussion section, what it's important for is for interpreting the results. So the results, you include all of the statistical jargon, F's and P's and T's and so on and so forth. The discussion translates all of that into layperson terms or into English terms, right? Now we're using actual sentences to talk about what was found. So you're focusing primarily on the relationship between the findings and the hypotheses. So in the discussion, you start off by saying, it was hypothesized that, and the hypotheses were either supported or not supported. And if you have 1, 2, or 3 hypotheses, you would do the same for all of those. This should follow the structure of your results. So if you presented results, for the first hypothesis, then you would talk about the first hypothesis, in that way in the discussion. Okay. So just make sure that you follow the same order as you report them in the results. Okay. It is a complete but non-technical summary of the results. Like I said, you leave out all of the t-tests, all of the ANOVAs, and very importantly, you do not include any numbers in the discussion. Any number is meant to be included only in the result. Okay, like I said, you're using actual English here. You leave out all the numerical terms and all of that for the results. Also, you are not restricted to use the same references as you used in the intro. Oftentimes, based on your findings, you will need additional references. Okay, so we'll talk all about how to include references, how to look up good references, and so on and so forth as we continue throughout the course. All right. Let's go ahead and go here. So at the beginning of the section, okay, what you must start off with is a restatement of the purpose. So what was the purpose? And then you move on to stating the main hypothesis. Once again, you explain the findings, but without the use of statistics. Then you move on and talk about whether you supported or didn't support the hypotheses, or whether you confirmed or disconfirmed the hypotheses. Okay, you restate each hypothesis and you do the same type of writing for all of these. All right. Okay, so we support our results, okay, even if we didn't find what we predicted. Okay, so once you've talked about whether you supported or didn't support the hypothesis, you have to provide reasons why. So why is it that we found the results that we did? This is where you tie in other literature. So you say, we found this finding maybe because of this other finding that was also present before in the literature. Or we didn't find this finding because of what these researchers are saying, right? So you're always tying in different pieces of work to be able to explain your own findings. This is not your interpretation of the results. This is not, I think we found this because so on and so forth. No, you say these results were found because these other researchers discussed that these variables operate in this way, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not your interpretation, it's mainly an interpretation that you're giving, but through the perspective of previous research. Okay. All right, you end the discussion with limitations. So what were the flaws of the study? And implications. What do our findings mean? How do they relate to the overall body of research? How do they inform practice, right? So maybe how do they inform educational practices or clinical practices? All right. Okay, the references I'll come back to in a future lecture. So just know that this is where you simply list all the citations that you used. And then we have tables and figures. So once again, I'm going to leave talking in depth about the references and the tables and figures for later, okay? But just know that they are also part of the parts of a APA manuscript, okay? So with that, I would like to conclude, okay, this first lecture. Please, after this, go on and view the second lecture for today, because that will detail exactly what you need to do to start experiment 1. We are starting experiment 1 today, and there is something that you need to turn in by Tuesday, and you'll need to know what to turn in. So go ahead and move on to watching the second part of today's lecture. All right.